All right, we'll say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. And thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves. Shirim this month are dedicated by the Daf Yomi Shir La'aliyas Neshama of Mr. Martyr Mordechai David Ben Rafael HaKohen. To thank Shirley Elbaum and family for dedicating Ovis Sherman Joshos this month in commemoration of the yard site of Jerry Elbaum, Yaakov Couple Ben Avram Menachem, and our week of learning sponsors Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the learning this week in the Susa Refuah Shalima for Shulamis Bas Susha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, their families in Nechama, and those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Post with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us. Today's daf is Samech 65. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem. We have a lot to do. We are picking up on Samech Daled Amud Beis 64b, and let's actually pick up at V'Rabbanan Mai Tamayu. So we'll say that is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say, if you remember again, the dramatic machlokus we had in the Mishnah was Poschin Benolad. Can you create a Pesach with a new piece of information that has come to life? Something, remember, let's take one step back. We're talking about Hataras Nedarim. The way to accomplish Hataras Nedarim is through a Pesach, to creating an opening, right? An opening, kind of the overarching concept of opening is charata, is remorse, meaning that there is a piece of information that I know now that had I been aware of at the time of the neder, I would have what? Not made the neder. Good. That's your typical Pesach. Now the question is, what happens if new information comes to light now, but the information was not present, the information didn't exist at the time of the neder? So remember again, what was the paradigmatic example? I make a neder, I'm not going to get any hana from Ruvain. Then what happens? Ruvain becomes a sulfur, and he's the only sulfur in town. So now I say to myself, had I realized that Ruvain was going to become a sulfur, I would have never made this neder to begin with. Now again, that's new information. The information was not in the world at the time of the neder. So is that enough to create a Pesach? So I will say, ultimately again, this is a machlokas. So Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, this works. And the Chachamim say, no, it does not work. So now the Gemara is delving into machlokas. So where does Rabbi Eliezer see this from? So the Gemara says, interesting enough, Rabbi Eliezer learns this from Moshe Rabbeinu. That what happened, and we're going to discuss this in today's daf. Moshe Rabbeinu made a neder to Yisro that he would not leave Midyan. And then what happens? HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, listen, good news, everyone who wanted to kill you died. So now go back to Yisro, right? Do Hataras Nedarim. Why? Because ultimately, again, new piece of information over here. Right? New information, the guys are dead. So the Rabbi Eliezer says, you see from here that new information, nolad, can create a Pesach. On the other hand, so now we're up to V'Rabbanan. What did the Rabbanan do with this? V'Rabbanan Mai Tamayu, Kasarvi Hanau Mimaisi, we read this yesterday. Did Dasan Aviram die? Dasan Aviram didn't die. V'Ham Rabbi Yochanan B'Shmar B'Shem Yochai Kamakum Shnemar Nitzim Nitzavim Einu Ela Dasan Aviram Ela Amrei Shlakish Yadu Minichseihen. Rather, Rabbi say the Rabbanan, what happened to Dasan Aviram? They became impoverished. Now, I will say, so what? Like, how does that answer? How does that answer the shaila? Right? Remember again, Rabbi Eliezer is saying, you see from this story. Here's what we know. Right? Let's take the facts. Fact number 1: Moshe Rabbeinu made a neder, right, to Yisro that he's not leaving Midyan. Fact number 2: in order to go ahead and leave Midyan, what does Moshe Rabbeinu need? What does he need? Hataras Nedarim. Right? Incredible, right? Even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling him he needs Hataras Nedarim, Lo B'Shamayim Hi, a Jew has to live within the confines and construct of halacha, no exceptions, even Moshe Rabbeinu. So fine. So Rabbi says, okay, so now Dasan Aviram died. Hashem saying, no Lord works for a Pesach. The Rabbanim saying, no, Dasan Aviram didn't die, they became impoverished. Okay, but still, Moshe Rabbeinu is going to be leaving Midyan, so obviously the neder was dissolved. Rabbi say, watch this. Take a look at the rush. So Rabbi say, this is the rush. Look at literally the last 2 lines on the page, on the entire page. Ella, Kidam Reish Lakish Yedom Minchsein. This is incredible. The Chevan Da'aniyim Heim Lo Hayu Yichol Naziko. Now, first of all, since Dasan and Aviram were impoverished, therefore, again, they didn't have the ability to harm Moshe Rabbeinu. She'ein Divreihem Nishmoin Va'anius Lav Nolatu D'Shchiach. Wow. Wow. Rabbi say, watch this. If you remember again, going back to the Mishnah, why didn't the Rabbanon agree with Rabbi Eliezer about Nolad? Why didn't they agree about Nolad? So Rabbi say, the whole chap of a Pesach is what? Is the idea that had I known then what I know now, I wouldn't have what? Made the neder. The Rabbanon will say that only applies in a way where we are certain that had you had that information at the time of the neder, you wouldn't have made the neder. The whole chap of nolad is nolad represents circumstances that are not common. And the Rabbanon say, when it comes to uncommon circumstances, even as you presented the vower with the possibility of these uncommon circumstances, he still may have vowed. Meaning, I'll give you an example. I take a neder that I'm not going to get hana from Ruvain. So imagine for a moment that somebody would have said to me at the time of the neder, but you know, what happens if Ruvain becomes the sofer? Ruvain becomes the sofer. That's like when monkeys fly. In other words, like what are you talking? Ruvain. So in other words, I will say that reality is not necessarily a reality that will come to fruition. So Lamaisa, because it's not a reality, like even if someone said that to me, I might have said, you know what, I'll roll the dice on that one. In other words, I might have still vowed. The Rabbanan say a Pesach only works when we are certain that had you had that information at the time of the vow, you wouldn't have vowed. But something that is uncommon, a person may have still vowed. So I'll say, watch this. The Rabbanan say that poverty is a certain circumstance. Poverty is a milsa deshchicha. It's a common circumstance. So because it's a common circumstance, therefore it's not called nolad. Because it's not called nolad, it could create a Pesach, which I will say is a fascinating thing, because what the Rabbanan seem to be saying is death is not a common circumstance. Poverty is a common circumstance. I will say that sounds a little bit strange because death is a pretty common circumstance. So the Mashal explains something incredibly profound here, which is that, of course, death is this common circumstance. In the eyes of most people, although I know that death will occur, it's a far removed reality from me, which is good. Conversely, we see every single day that people become poor. Every single day, regular people become poor, wealthy people become poor people become wealthy, regular people, in other words, that wealth, like Chazal says, is like a gal hamiskalgel. It's a wheel that turns. So the notion, ultimately, again, that someone's financial circumstances change in a day, that's common. So therefore, the Rabbanon say that's the Pesach over here, and it's not nolad because poverty is not an uncommon circumstance. Incredible. So the Gemara goes back there. So I'll say now the Gemara mentioned this about poverty. Any person who doesn't have children is considered to be like he's dead. We'll see exactly what this means. Emar, Havali Banim, Vim Ayin Me Sanochi, Rachel Imenu. Rachel Imenu says to Yaakov, give me children, and if not, it's as if I am dead. Vitanya, Arba Chashuvin Kimes, 4 people are considered to be like they're dead. Ani, Mitzora, Vesuma, Umisha in Lobanim. Someone who's poor, someone who has saras, someone who is blind, and someone who does not have children. So let's go through these. Mitzora dechsiv anati kimes. So we'll start this when Miriam was stricken by saras. Aaron says to Moshe, don't treat our sister like she's dead. Vesuma dechsiv machshakim oshivani kimese olam. By a suma, by a blind person, the pasuk says, in the darkness, you have led me like the dead of the world. Umisha'in lo banim dechsiv havali banim. So I will say these are the psukim ultimately that go ahead and explain these dynamics. So I will say it's beautiful. The Sasem Rebbe says, what's the common denominator amongst all of these individuals? So the Sasem says they're all cut off from others. Right? I will say if you think about this in just a moment, right? The ani is often someone who's cut off, who is marginalized by society. The Metzora, literally Badad Yeshev, has to live separately than everyone else. The Suma, the blind person, again, is often separated from other individuals. And Misha'in Labanim, someone who struggles with infertility, Rabosai, is often a very isolating experience. When people are cut off from the community, it's chashuv kames. The lifeline of the Jew is being part of the kehillah. The lifeline of the Jew is being part of something bigger than yourself. The lifeline of the Jew is being part of the Am. And when I have personal circumstances that make me feel isolated, there's a quasi-death-like experience that occurs there. They both say it's also, so first of all, it's just a profound idea about where, and we know this, we know this, where does my lifeline come from? My lifeline comes from being part of something bigger than me. So when I have personal circumstances that isolate me from the clown, that creates almost like a death-like experience for me. Because we'll say, what's death? What's the whole chap of death? The whole chap of death is you're by yourself, right? You're alone. You don't go through death without. You could go through the process of dying with other people. Other people could be around you when you're dying. But Lamaisa, death is something you go at all by yourself. These experiences in life that isolate me a little bit socially, that isolate me a little bit communally, there's a death-like experience, which I will say is why it's so incredibly important to be sensitive to this as well. On the other side, that when I see a person is struggling with these things, how important it is. Again, so the Matzorah piece, we could look at as illness. A person is suffering with poverty. A person is suffering with illness. And again, you could even include blindness in that as well. A person is suffering with infertility. To recognize that all of those things could be such profoundly isolating experiences, and how sensitive the community has to be to try to enfranchise those individuals as well. Incredible. Bosai top of Samechei. Tanya, interesting case here. Hamudra haname chavera imatirno alabafanov. Shabosai, this is really interesting. If you take a neder not to go ahead and benefit from someone, so the annulment or revocation of that neder must take place in front of the person, in the presence of the person who is the subject of that neder. So we'll say, in other words, that if I take a neder not to benefit from Ruvain, if I'm going to have that neder annulled, that annulment has to take place in the presence of Ruvain. Now, the Ran gives two interpretations for this. If you look at the Ran on the left-hand side, it says, so we'll say, so one possibility is that the Ran says this could be in a case where I took a neder to benefit someone else, or that is beneficial to someone else, and now I'm going to have that neder revoked. It's important that the other person know that that neder is being revoked, so they shouldn't think that I'm shirking my responsibilities. The Ran then gives just a second, more practical idea. He says, mipnei hachashad, right? In order to avoid any suspicion. In other words, if I took a neder not to get benefit from Ruvain, and now suddenly one day I'm getting benefit from Ruvain, what does that look like? I'm in violation of my neder. So in order to avoid any type of suspicion, ultimately, again, the neder should be revoked in the presence of the person who is the subject of that neder. Okay, so again, the Ran really frames this in two different ways, but for our purposes, I take a neder not to benefit from Ruvain, lemaisa, that neder should be revoked in the presence of Ruvain. Either the Ran says because there could be some element of benefit, and if you're going to remove a neder which confers benefit, ultimately both parties should be present, or chashad, in order to avoid suspicion. So the Gemara says, where do we know this from? So the Gemara says, where do we know this from? So what happens? Hashem says to Moshe in Midyan. I will say, why does the pasuk need to say that they were in Midyan? We know they're in Midyan, right? So Hashem says to Moshe when he's in Midyan, go back to Egypt, because all of the people who died, or all the people who wanted to harm you have died. So why does he need to say b'Midyan? Amar lo, b'Midyan nadarta, lech b'hater nedarecha be'eretz Midyan. So Hashem says to Moshe, listen, that's because in Midyan you made your neder, and therefore again in Midyan, it's very important that you revoke the neder. Dichsiv, Vayoel Moshe, the pasuk says Vayoel Moshe. I will say that pasuk literally means the way we normally translate it was Vayoel Moshe lasheves es haish. Moshe began or continued to go ahead and dwell with his father-in-law. But the Gemara says no. The lashon of Vayoel ein Allah ela shvua. The word Allah means an oath. Dichsiv vayaveo so ba'Allah. He brought him in an oath. So we'll say we're going to see this. We're going to see this in just a moment as well. This is the King Tzidkiyahu with Nebuchadnezzar. So we'll say let's pause here for just a moment because this is going to get into another fascinating story. So we'll say so. I just want to point out something really interesting, which is that the Moshe Rabbeinu story serves as the source so far for two important concepts in Nedarim. So for Rabbi Eliezer, the Moshe story serves as a source for what? Poschen benolad, that you can go ahead and create a Pesach with new information that comes about that was not present, that didn't exist at the time of the Neder. Moshe makes a Neder to dwell with Yisro, right? Ultimately, part of that Neder was in deference to Yisro, but part of that Neder was because Moshe Rabbeinu was scared to go back to Mitzrayim. Now Hashem says to Moshe, by the way, the guys who wanted to harm you are dead. So therefore, again, that's Nolad, new information. Go back to Yisro, and now you can get out of your neder. That's piece of information number one. Piece of information number two is that when you make a neder that involves another person, revocation of that neder must be done in that person's presence. Now again, why is that? So again, so the Ran says it's possible that this halacha only applies in a case where the neder you made benefits someone else. So you don't want to go cold turkey on benefiting someone else. That doesn't look right. So you should involve them in the revocation so they understand why the benefit is going to cease. But then he says, no, even in a case where you're not benefiting someone else, Lamaisa, when someone else is a party to the neder, I make a neder not to get benefit from Ruvain. Suddenly tomorrow I'm getting hana from Ruvain. In order that it doesn't look I'm in violation of my neder, Ruvain should be present at the time of the revocation. Where do we see that if you make a neder that either benefits someone else or someone else is involved in, they need to be present for the revocation? Moshe Rabbeinu. Because Hashem says to Moshe, listen, Moshe, you made the neder in Midyan, you got to do revocation in Midyan, which means do revocation in the presence of your father-in-law of Yisro. That's where he understands that the neder is done. Incredible. Now I will say, the way the Gemara knew that was because of the lashon of Vayoel. Allah means Shavua. Where do we know that Allah means Shavua? Get ready for this, Rabbi said. This is dramatically amazing. This comes from the story ultimately of Nebuchadnezzar and Tzidkiyahu. So remember again, Nebuchadnezzar was the king who destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash. So after he already conquered Eretz Israel, was already under his control, he installed Tzidkiyahu as king. So now watch this. So the pasuk says as follows: Vayavosa ba'Allah, v'gam melech Nebuchadnezzar marad asher ishpiu be'elokim chayim. So the Navi tells a story of Tzidkiyahu's rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. So we'll say, so what happens? So now watch this. So Maimar do say, how did Tzidkiyahu rebel? We'll say, so remember, the rebellion of Tzidkiyahu was really the end of the Churban story. So Maimar do say, we'll say it's a pretty wild story. What was the rebellion of Tzidkiyahu against Nebuchadnezzar? So what happened? Ashkechei Tzidkiyahu Nebuchadnezzar. So one time Tzidkiyahu walked in on Nebuchadnezzar eating a live rabbit. Amrlei, Ishtar, obviously eating a live rabbit is a pretty barbaric thing to do, right? I guess regular rabbit it tastes like chicken, right? Whatever it is, so whatever. So if you're gonna eat it cooked or whatever. He was literally eating a live rabbit. So Tzidkiyahu walks in on this. So what happens? So Nebuchadnezzar made Tzidkiyahu swear that Tzidkiyahu would never divulge that which he saw. Made him take an oath or a neder. So I'll say, so what happened? So I will say, by the way, I'll just point out to you, what is it? Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most powerful men in the world. So what's the pshat that he's eating a live rabbit? What's the pshat? See, I will say, because you see something incredibly profound. You could have wealth, you could have power, you could have cover, you could have all those things. If you do not work on refining your character, you're just a barbarian in king's clothing. So I will say that was Nebuchadnezzar. And you see this, by the way, all the time. I will say, sometimes, right, you see this in people in positions of leadership who have all the trappings of power, but themselves are morally corrupt individuals. Because at the end of the day, it's not power that makes you great, right? It's greatness that ultimately leads a person to power. And sometimes when a person who's not great gets power, that's where things kind of go off the rails. So what's incredibly profound about the story is you could be the strongest sovereign on the face of the earth, but if you don't work on refining your personality, you're just a barbarian in monarchical clothing. And that's what Tzidkiyahu walked in on. That's what he walked in on over here, right? The king could order anything he wants from whoever he wants, but that barbaric part of him was still rooted in these base behaviors. So why is Nebuchadnezzar so concerned about this getting out? Why is he concerned about it? Because Lamaisa would totally undermine his authority. Because people expect their king to behave a certain way. And if it gets out that he's eating live rabbits, Lamaisa could totally undermine his authority. So he makes Tzidkiyahu take an oath. So I'll say what happened. L'sof havakum and tsar. So I'll say, so now what happened? L'sof havakum and tsar Tzidkiyahu b'gufei. I will say, so holding on to this information was physically painful for Tzidkiyahu. Now, why was it physically painful for Tzidkiyahu? So the Ran explains over here something very interesting, which is Tzidkiyahu understood that he was sitting on a piece of very important information. Why? Because if he could tell other people about this whole rabbit episode, perhaps what that could do is undermine support for Nebuchadnezzar. And if you could undermine support for Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps Eretz Yisrael could shake free of being a vassal state, and maybe there could be some type of rebellion. So it's literally causing Tzidkiyahu pain that he's sitting on this information. So say, so what happened? It shall at Shavuosei. So it shall Shavuosei. V'amar. So we'll say, so now what happens? So Tzidkiyahu goes to the Sanhedrin and he petitions for release of his vow. And amazingly enough, and what happens? The Sanhedrin releases him. So Shama Nebuchadnezzar, the Kamavazin lay. So Nebuchadnezzar suddenly hears that everybody's talking about the rabbit episode. So I'll say, so now there's only one person who knows about the rabbit episode, Rabbit Gate, right? There's only one person who knows about Rabbit Gate, right? And who is it? It's Tzidkiyahu. It's Tzidkiyahu. So Shalach va'isi Sanhedrin v'Tzidkiyahu. So Nebuchadnezzar calls for an emergency meeting of the Sanhedrin together with Tzidkiyahu. Amar lahon chazisun mai ka'avet Tzidkiyahu. So again, so Nebuchadnezzar says to the Sanhedrin, do you see what Tzidkiyahu did? Do you see what Tzidkiyahu has done? Lav hachi yishtaba b'shma d'shmai delo maglino. So ultimately, again, so Nebuchadnezzar turns to Tzidkiyahu. Did you not swear by the name of your God? You took an oath by the name of your God that ultimately, again, you would not divulge this information. Amarle ishali at shvuasa. So ultimately, again, so the Sanhedrin defended Tzidkiyahu by saying to Nebuchadnezzar, listen, Chizkiyahu came to us and he petitioned us for release from the vow, release from the oath. Amarle mishalana shvuasa. Amarle in. Amarlu b'fanav. O shelo b'fanav. So Nebuchadnezzar did the daf. Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, Chevra, let me ask you a question. When you take a neder or a shvuah that involves another person, does revocation have to take place in front of the associated party or not? They said in front of the associated party. So Amrle b'fanav Amrlehon va'asun maya viditin my time alone recently Tzidkiyahu. So he says, he gives the Sanhedrin Musar. He says, Sanhedrin said, let me ask you, I was a party to this oath. So even if you think that you have the right to go ahead and release Tzidkiyahu, how could you have done that not in my presence? How could you have done that without me present? So let's say, so listen to this. Miad yashvu la'aretz. Yashvu la'aretz yidmu ziknei b'asiyon am Rabbi Yitzchak sheshamtu karmet tachtein. In that moment, I will say what happened. So remember, the Sanhedrin used to sit on cushions. They're the equivalent of chairs. What did Tzidkiyahu, what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He removed the chairs of the cushions and made them sit on the floor. So ultimately, I will say, so it's fascinating story. So the Ran has a whole discussion over here. The Ran says, well, if you look at the last short line, so the Ran says, V'achinami midisharli Sanhedrin, now first wide line, L'Tzidkiyahu v'afilu b'di'eved eino moter hechi havi sharli L'Tzidkiyahu l'galuye milsa, masha di'eved shari, v'chite makata kashni di'eved shari l'chatchila miu aser, v'hechi sharli Sanhedrin L'Tzidkiyahu. So we'll say, the Ran deals with, he says, okay, the Nebuchadnezzar is saying good. Right? Nebuchadnezzar is saying, good, at the end of the day, how did the Sanhedrin release Tzidkiyahu from his oath vow without Nebuchadnezzar present? Right? In other words, Rabbi say that is the halacha, by the way, that when you make a neder that involves another person, hatara, revocation, has to take place with them present, ideally. So how did the Sanhedrin release Tzidkiyahu without Nebuchadnezzar being present? So the Ran gives an interesting answer. He says, Rose, second line in the wide lines, middle of that line, dvar mitzvah matirin, v'tzidkiyahu haya mitzta'er biyoser kishlo hayyochal galos, umispatal ayidei kach mimalecha shamayim. So this is very interesting. So one possibility is, while it's true that normally you need the other party to be present at revocation, it is permitted to revoke a neder without the other party present for the purpose of a mitzvah. Apparently, the inability to divulge this information was causing Tzidkiyahu so much pain that he wasn't even able to do mitzvahs, he wasn't able to learn, he wasn't able to daven, and therefore the Sanhedrin felt that Lamaiseh was a mitzvah reason to go ahead and release him even without Nebuchadnezzar present. The second possibility was, Begam mitzvahs hamelech shemitzav aleim latiro mitzvi aleim lekayim. So what's the other possibility is, when the king commands, Tzidkiyahu is the king, when the king commands you to do something, it is a mitzvah to listen to the king. So essentially what the Ran is saying, what the Ran is saying is that halacha l'maisa, when the king needs something, it's a mitzvah to fulfill the word of the king. So whether they saw that Tzidkiyahu was in such pain that he was unable to serve Hashem, therefore they felt it was a dvar mitzvah to go ahead and release him, or it's a mitzvah to listen to the king. Apparently, they felt they had a mitzvah license to revoke the neder, even not in the presence of Nebuchadnezzar. Rabbi say an incredible story, both about the Musar, about Rabbi say. By the way, I just want to point out, this is why we learn Mesilas Yesharim every single morning before Daf Yomi. Because Rabbi say, remember, Daf is great, and Gemara is great, but we also need character refinement. Now, the truth is, you can get incredible character refinement from the Gemara. That is true, and we've seen that over our years of the study of Daf. But this is why the study of Musar is a crucial and indispensable part of our personalistic development. Because otherwise, what can you have? You can become a person who becomes great in so many areas, but inside you're still a barbarian. This was Nebuchadnezzar. He became accomplished and great in some, right? He's the strongest man in the world. And yet, in the privacy of his own home, he's eating raw rabbits. You think to yourself, how does that happen? Abba says it's very simple. You know how it happened? Nebuchadnezzar didn't come to Mesilas Yesharim. That's how it happened. That's how it happened. When you become a Jew who learns a lot, does a lot, but you don't do Musar, you could have all the robes of Torah accomplishment, but in the privacy of your own life, you're eating rabbits because you don't have character refinement. That's what Musar gives to us. It refines who and what we are, so that as we acquire the external trappings of becoming a Ben Torah, of becoming again a Talmid Chacham, all of those internal trappings are incredibly important, as long as on the inside, I'm being refined as well. You could acquire the external levels, but again, in the privacy of your own self, are still a barbarian. Musar refines that inner self so that I become a complete individual inside and out. Incredible. Abba says to the Mishnah. There's a lot of good halacha l'maisa over here also, but maybe we'll come back to it if we have time at the end of the shir. So Mishnah, Abba says, great. Rabbi Meir Omer, Yesh Dvarim she'ein kinolad ve'ein kinolad. Abba says there are things that are like nolad but aren't nolad. Okay, what does that mean? He says, listen to this, ve'ein chachamim modim lo. But the chachamim ultimately, again, do not agree. Do not agree. So says the Gemara, Ketzad, Amar konam sha'ani nose es plonis shavia ra. So we'll say the very interesting case over here. Let's say a man says, I take a neder that I'm not going to marry a certain woman. Right? I'm not going to marry a certain person. Why? Because her father is evil. Shavia ra. Amrulo, so they say to the individual, Meis osha asa tshuva. Ultimately, again, don't worry, because the father died, or he did tshuva. He did tshuva, right? So ultimately, again, so remember, just to frame the case, ultimately the individual went ahead and said, I'm taking a neder not to go ahead and marry this person. I give a very specific, marry this woman. Why? Her father is evil. it turns out then that they say her father did tshuva or died. Now, both say, so what's happened in this case? This isn't nolad. What is this really? What is this really? Mistaken information. Mistaken information, right? Amru lo meisa she'asa tshuva, or konam l'bayis zeh. So both say, or a person says, first of all, take a look at the Ran, right? The Ran says as follows. We'll say 5 lines up from the bottom. Yesh dvarim shein kinola ve'eino kinola fi shehu kitolet nidro bidavar. Ultimately, again, it's what's happening over here. It's as if a person has gone ahead and linked their neder to a particular reality. That's what's happening over here. Tola neder bidavar. I'm connecting my neder to a particular reality. So I won't marry this woman because her father is evil. Now it turns out that what? Her father is not evil. Either because he's dead or because he's done tshuva. Because he's done tshuva. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Right, what we'll say the halacha is, Amrulo, Meis Asa Tshuva, or Konim L'Bayis Eshain Nichnas. Supposed to listen to this. Or I say, I make a neder. I'm not going into this particular house. Why? Shakelev Ra B'socho. There's a bad dog in the house. It's a bad dog in the house. Oh, Shanachash B'socho. Or, I'm not going to say anything about dogs, because I get a lot of feedback about, I'm sorry? It's not all right, about dog comments. But I just want to point out that if you notice again, it puts dogs and snakes in the same category. I'm just saying that's not me, that's Chazal. That's Chazal, right? So say, so ultimately again, so I'm not going into this house because there's a bad dog, or there's a snake in there. So we'll say, so again, in this case, Lamaisa, I'm going ahead and I'm not going into this place because of the dog or the snake. Amrlo, Mesa Kelev, the dog died. Or the snake died. Harihain kinolad ve'inan kinolad. So we'll say these are like cases of nolad. So we'll say the reason why the Gemara says it's like nolad is why. It was like why? Because again, it sounds like there's new information, but at the end of the day, it's not nolad. Now we'll say go back to the Ran for just a moment. 5 lines up from the bottom. Lefishu kitoled nidro b'davar. Now we'll say so. The reason why this isn't really nolad is because it's clear in this case. I'm making my neder based on certain, or dependent on certain realities. It then turns out that what? The realities I thought were present are not present. Therefore, we'll say, so this is a much simpler case, because ultimately what this sounds like is it's almost like you're making a neder al t'nai, right, with a condition, right? I'm not marrying this girl because her father's evil. Well, her father's not evil, either because he did tshuva or he died. I'm not going into his house because there's a dog or there's a snake. Well, the dog and the snake died. So the Maisa again, in this case, the Gemara says, that the Mishnah says, Tanakama says, it should work. Ultimately, again, in other words, that the neder is void, and ultimately, Chacham don't agree in this case. Let's analyze. So konam shani nichnas labayis eshakel meis noladu. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So why isn't this nolad? Why isn't this nolad? The Gemara says. It's not nolad. Say why? Because this lashon of nase kitol nidro b'davar means essentially. It's like I'm making the neder with a t'nai. In other words, I'm attaching my neder. I'm not just saying I'm not marrying this girl. I'm not just saying I'm not going into this house. In other words, I will say very specifically, I'm saying I'm not doing this. Well, I'm not doing this because clearly I'm telling you the circumstances or the realities that are motivating this neder. I will not marry this girl because her father is a Rasha. I will not go into this house because of the dog. So therefore, again, Rav Huna says, because I'm explicitly articulating the reasons for my neder, therefore, when those reasons are not in effect, the neder essentially what? Goes away. Goes away. Look at the Ran for just a moment. The Ran writes, Ki deprecious mishum hachi shari afilu below she'ilas chacham. Rabbi say that's the chap. Rav Huna is going to say essentially, this is making a neder with a t'nai. And therefore, once it turns out that the t'nai was incorrect, or is making a neder based on certain information, now, tola b'davar, I'm attaching it to something. Once it's clear that the something no longer applies, therefore what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, the neder is no longer in effect. Rabbi Yochanan says, kivar meis, or kivar asa tshuva ka'amrila. So I will say, this is very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, what's the case? I will say, the case is where we tell the guy already at the time of the neder, the father died. In other words, I will say, What's interesting, according to Rav Huna, is, in this case, I say I'm not going to marry this girl because her father's a Rasha. Then what happens? They tell me he did tshuva or he died. Rabbi say, when did he do tshuva or die? When did that happen? Sometime after the time of the neder. But Rav Huna is going to say that's okay because the Maisa is clear you've made your neder based on certain circumstances. The circumstances changed and therefore the neder goes away. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, what's the case? The case is where I say I'm not going to marry this girl because her father's a Rasha. Then they tell me, oh no, by the way, at the time you had made the neder, the father was already dead. In other words, so already at the time you made the neder, the father was dead. So look at the Ran. Kilomar shemis kodem nidro v'havile neder tos. Fascinating. So we'll say ultimately, again, in this case, what they say is it's a mistake. It's a mistake, right? The father was already dead at the time of the neder. And therefore, again, halacha lemaisa, the whole neder was neder tos. So we'll say, see what's happening over here? See what's happening? This is really quite fascinating. There are two different things which are occurring over here. So machlokes, I will say about how this case in the Mishnah is working. According to Rav Huna, this is working because tola bedavar, you're attaching the neder to a specific reality, and now the reality is void. Therefore, the neder becomes void. It becomes batal, kind of by itself. Rabbi Yochanan is saying it's a neder tos. It's a mistaken neder because at the time of the neder, the information you thought was correct was really not correct. Amar Beis will say, Master Rabbi Abba. So Rabbi Abba raises a kasha. Konam sheni no seliplonius kiura. It's an interesting case. Right? I make a neder. I'm not going to marry this woman. She's not attractive. Kura literally means like ugly. She's not attractive. I v'harihi noah. It turns out that she's beautiful. Shchora v'hari levan. I'm not going to marry her because she's dark complexion. It turns out that she's light complexioned. Kitsara. I'm not marrying her because she's short, but it turns out that she's tall. Muterba, ultimately he's allowed to marry this woman, clearly a very deep individual, right? So I'll say, so what happened? See, he's allowed to marry her. Muterba. And I will say, now watch this. Lo mipnei sheku'ura v'nasis, no, it's not because she was ugly and then became beautiful, or shchora v'nasa lavana, she was dark complexion and then became light complexion, or kitzara v'nasa saruk, or she was short and then became tall. Ella shaneder tos. Right? I will say why? Because lemaisa, it was a mistake in neder. I will say, I want to point out, this is a Mishnah we're going to see in a couple of dapim from, actually tomorrow. Right? So I will say, this is another case. This is another case in Nedarim. So I will say, so just look what's happening over here. This is a further Mishnah. So now I will say, so the question is, why does the Mishnah need to bring this case? So this is a paradigmatic example of a neder tos. So I say, I'm not going to marry Rachel. Why? Because she's short. She's short. I want a tall wife. She's short. And now they tell me, oh, you know what? No, she's not tall. She's not short. She's tall. So what's halacha? What's halacha? My neder is void. Why is my neder void? Why? Neder tos. Okay, now hold that. So says the Gemara. Bishlama Rav Huna, the Amar Nasek Yitol Neder. So say, now let's go back for just a second. We have our case in the Mishnah. What's our case in the Mishnah? I'm not going to marry Rachel. Why? Because her father is a Rasha. So now the Gemara says it turns out that he's not a Rasha. Either he died or he did tshuva. So now why is it that my neder is now no longer in effect? So there's a machlokes Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Huna says it's because this is called tola b'davar acher, or tola nidro b'davar. This is called attaching your neder to a reality, and then when the reality is no longer true, the neder kind of just falls off. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, this is a case of a neder tos. I thought that Rachel's father was a Rasha. It turns out that what? At the time of the neder, he was already dead. A neder tos. So we'll say, now watch this. It says, Bishtam the Rav Huna, Tamar Nasek Yitol Nidro B'davar, Tana Tol Nidro B'davar, V'tana neder tos. So we'll say, according to Rav Huna, who holds that our Mishnah that we just read before is Tola B'davar, a case where you're attaching your neder to a reality. And then our Mishnah, our present Mishnah, is coming to teach us that what? That Allah Kalamaisa, when you attach your neder to a current reality, and then that reality is no longer true, the neder falls off by itself. That's what our Mishnah is coming to teach us. And the next Mishnah is coming to teach us about what? Neder tos. It makes sense. El Rabbi Yochanan d'Amar kvar meis, ukvar asa tshuva, lama li lemisni tri zimni neder tos. Rabbi said, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that our Mishnah is a case of neder tos, Where Rabbi say what? I say I'm not going to marry Rachel because her father's a tshuva, her father's a rasha, and then it turns out that what? They tell me, no, it's okay, her father already did tshuva, so it turns out that what? I made a mistake, right? I made the neder with mistaken information. So Rabbi say, why do I need this Mishnah and the next Mishnah to teach you the halacha of neder tos? To which the Gemara says, kasha. That is a good question on Rabbi Yochanan. So therefore, I will say again, here's what we have so far. So I will say, so halacha l'maisa, we have a couple of pieces of halacha we still have to resolve. Number one, when you take a neder about that involves someone else, do you have to annul it in their presence? That's issue number we have to resolve. Issue number two, I will say, deals with the neder in this type of mishnah, where you take a neder based on specific information, and it turns out that the information is no longer true. No longer true. So the Tanakama says, no problem, the neder simply slips away by itself. The Chum say, no, that does not work. How do we pass it? In that case, we'll have to see. And I will say, now we're being introduced to neder ta'us as well. So again, let me just tell you quickly, just for the sake of, so we'll say, when it comes to taking a neder in the presence of someone else, or that involves someone else, the Rambam paskins, so whenever you take a neder that involves someone else, revocation of that neder must be done in that person's presence. That's the Rambam Hilchos Shvuos, Parak Vav Halacha Zayin. Next, I will say, if a person goes ahead, we'll get to neder talis in just a moment. I will say, listen to this. What about a person, let's say the Rambam uses our case. So this is Hilchos Nedarim, Parak Ches Halacha Beis. I take a neder, I'm not going to marry Rachel because her father is a rasha. Right? Or I'm not going to enter into a house because there's a dog in it. So what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, if it turns out that the father's dead, or he did tshuva, or the dog died, I'm allowed to enter into the house, marry Rachel. Why? So the Rambam paskins, like the Tanakama in our Mishnah, namely, that if you go ahead and you make a neder, and you are tola b'davar, you attach your neder to a specific reality, and that reality changes, the neder falls away by itself. So when I make it clear, I'm not marrying Rachel because her father is a rasha. Now what happens? Her father is no longer a rasha. Why? Either because he did tshuva, or he died. Halacha l'maisa, now I'm permitted to marry Rachel. I make a neder, I'm not going into this house because there's a dog there, there's a snake there. The dog died, the snake died. I'm allowed to enter into that house. And again, I don't need hataras nedarim. I don't need to go to a chacham to have the neder and all the remote. This is called tola nidro bidavar. I attach my neder to a certain reality. Once that reality is no longer real, the neder falls off by itself. Good, let's go back there. Says the Mishnah. V'od Amar Rabbi Meir. Poschilo menakasa Shabbat Rabbos is a great case. We can also create a Pesach for someone based on something written in the Torah. V'omrim lo. Ilu ha'yisi odeh she'ata over alo sikom v'alo sitar. So let's give an example, right? Ruvain didn't lend me his lawnmower. So I make a neder. Ruvain, I hereby make a neder that you are never permitted to use anything of mine. What was the motivation of that neder? What's the motivation? I'm taking revenge, right? That's the motivation. So I'm taking revenge. So now, what happens? They say to me, listen, Silber, had you realized that taking a neder like that puts you in violation of a biblical prohibition of not taking revenge, would you have taken that neder? Or, for example, Lo sisnas achicha b'lavecha, v'yahavta l'recha kamocha, v'chai achicha imach. Ani ve'ein ata yachal lefarna. So I will say, for example, again, let's say they say to me that the neder I took is in violation of v'yahavta l'recha kamocha, loving your fellow Jew. I will say, tying to Mesilas Yesharim, incredible. Or I will say, here's a good one. I make a neder that Ruvain can't get any benefit from me. Nothing I have can benefit Ruvain. Turns out now that Ruvain is poor, right? And he needs help. Now, as a result of my neder, I can't help him. So the Beis Din says to me, had you realized when you made your neder that you would not be able to fulfill the biblical precept of v'chai achicha imach, to allow your brother to live with you, would you have made the neder? Amar lo ilo ayisi odeh shukein lo ayisi noder. And I say, no, you know what? Had I realized that at the time of the making of the neder, this would put me in violation of a biblical precept, I would have never made the neder. Ultimately, again, harei mutter. Ultimately, I will say, this is mutter, this is a form of neder revocation. I will say, so to be clear over here, there's really two different kinds of cases, right? So this over here, this is creating a Pesach. This is creating a Pesach, poschin lo min hakasa shel Torah, creating a Pesach through a mitzvah. Had I realized that the neder would put me at odds with the fulfillment of a particular biblical dictate, would I have done it? And if I say no, that creates a Pesach, that creates charata, and that allows for the neder to be annulled. Says the Gemara, Avli Rav Huna, Barav Katino Rabbanon, Nema called Dima'ani, Lav Alai Nofil. I don't understand. He'll say at the end of the day, even if so, let's play out this case. I take an neder not to give benefit to Reuven, right? Reuven becomes poor. So we say, so now the Beis says to me, had you realized that you would not be able to help Reuven, would you have taken the neder? Well, why can't I answer? Why can't I answer? Listen, I can't support every single poor person. In other words, it's not the pshat that I would support every single poor person. Kol damani lav nafa alai nafa. My demati li lefarnasa bahadi kuli ama v'farnasilei. It's incredible. At the end of the day, I can say like this: look, it's not the pshat that every single poor person comes to me, right? And I don't have the responsibility to support every single poor person. What I can also do is I can give to the general tzedakah fund and let the general tzedakah fund support Ruvain. Amrale. So Amrale ani omer kala nofel eino nofel lidei gabat tchila. Rabbi said this is actually quite profound. When a person falls on hard times, often their first stop is not the community charity fund. What's their first stop? Friends and family. Friends and family, when you fall on hard times, which Rabbi says is an incredible yisod in general, that friends and family are the first line of defense for a person who has fallen on difficult times. But Rabbi said the idea being that we say to Reuven, listen, while it's true that Reuven, they say to me, while it's true that Reuven could go to the community fund, Lemaisa, that's not going to be Reuven's first stop when he falls upon difficult times. His first stop is going to be to you, to his friends, to his family. So had you realized that this neder would prevent you from helping Reuven, would you have taken it? And then presumably I'm going to say no. And because I say no, ultimately that creates the Pesach for the neder. So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to do more with that case of the mitzvah Mir Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach.
See that way back when we were talking about two guys on the street by themselves. We had to feed his